In the year 1274, a huge fleet from the Mongol Empire set sail across the Sea of Japan, heading toward the island of Tsushima. This fleet included hundreds of ships carrying a mix of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops. It marked the Mongols' first major attempt to invade Japan. On Tsushima, only a small group of Japanese defenders stood ready. About 80 samurai and their followers, led by the island's governor, Sō Sukekuni, prepared to hold their ground. They knew they were badly outnumbered and no reinforcements were coming, but they chose to fight anyway. To understand how intense this moment was, it helps to look back at the Mongol Empire itself. In the heart of Asia, a new kind of power had risen. Fast, organized, and nearly unstoppable. Founded by Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire had expanded across continents. By 1260, his grandson Kublai Khan ruled a massive territory stretching from China to Europe. Kublai Khan was driven by ambition. After taking control of China and founding the Yuan dynasty, he ruled from his luxurious court in Xanadu. The Mongols believed it was their destiny to rule the world. In their eyes, nations either submitted or were in rebellion. Japan was one of the last remaining independent lands, and Kublai Khan wanted it. Some said Japan was rich in gold. Taking it would also block his enemies' trade and add more soldiers to his empire. But most of all, he saw Japan's refusal to submit as an insult. The Mongol army was one of the most advanced in the world. Their leaders were experts at organizing different types of troops: horsemen, foot soldiers, and siege teams, all working together. They used drums and gongs to signal commands, keeping their forces moving as one. Their tactics also included psychological warfare, like using prisoners as human shields or displaying piles of skulls to scare opponents. They also had a powerful new weapon: gunpowder. Mongol troops used early bombs, thrown by hand or launched by catapult, to break enemy lines and morale with loud, shattering explosions. This powerful force now turned toward Japan. At the time, Japan was under the Kamakura shogunate, a government controlled by military leaders. The country was run by the samurai class, warriors who lived by a strict code later called Bushido. Loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice were core values. Battles often began with individual challenges, as samurai would ride out, introduce themselves, and ask for one-on-one combat. But the samurai's traditional ways didn't prepare them for the type of warfare the Mongols would bring. In 1266, Kublai Khan sent a message demanding that Japan become part of his empire and pay tribute. The samurai leadership was deeply offended. They didn't reply, and when more envoys came, they were ignored too. Some reports say the Japanese even executed the Mongol messengers. Kublai Khan took this as a challenge that could only be answered by war, so he ordered a massive invasion. In Korean shipyards, hundreds of vessels were built. Historical sources say around 800 to 900 ships. The army included Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and Korean conscripts. Though legends say there were 50,000 men, modern estimates suggest about 20,000 to 40,000 troops took part in the 1274 campaign. Their plan was to capture small islands between Korea and mainland Japan, starting with Tsushima. Governor Sō Sukekuni led the defense of Tsushima. He was experienced, but his forces were tiny. Although some stories claim he had 200 samurai, the real number was closer to 80 mounted warriors, backed by a few hundred retainers. These fighters weren't just protecting land, they were defending their families and homes. When they saw the Mongol fleet approaching, many of the samurai wrote farewell poems, knowing they wouldn't survive. They weren't fighting to win, they were buying time and fighting for honor. On November 4th, 1274, the Mongol fleet appeared off the coast. That same day, a fire broke out at the local shrine to Hachiman, the war god. Sukekuni saw it as a sign to prepare. He gathered his warriors and rode through the night to Komoda Beach. Early the next morning, Mongol ships began landing. The invasion had begun. Sukekuni may have tried to speak with the invaders, but the Mongols answered with arrows. There was no respect, no ceremony, just immediate violence. One Japanese warrior tried to follow tradition, riding out alone, firing a signal arrow, and shouting his name to start a formal fight. The Mongols laughed, then filled him with arrows before he could even attack. In that moment, Sukekuni realized this wasn't a traditional battle. This was a collision between two completely different ways of war. Once Sō Sukekuni realized traditional combat had no place here, he gave one final, desperate command, a full-on charge straight into the enemy. All 80 samurai and their followers rushed into the Mongol lines with fearless intensity. At first, the Mongols were caught off guard by the force of the attack. The samurai's strong armor held up well, and their sharp blades tore through the lightly protected enemy troops. One of the Mongol commanders was even brought down during the fight. But the Mongols quickly adapted. They surrounded the smaller Japanese group, using their numbers to their advantage. Arrows filled the sky in waves, aimed not at individuals but at entire sections of the battlefield. Then came the most terrifying weapon, iron bombs called tetsuho. These were filled with gunpowder and metal fragments, thrown by hand or launched from catapults. When they exploded, the blasts were loud, violent, and disorienting. The chaos worsened. Horses panicked and threw their riders. Some samurai lost their sight or hearing. The Mongol drums and gongs pounded non-stop, confusing the defenders even more. The samurai's charge began to fall apart. They were surrounded, cut off from each other, and picked off one by one. Komoda Beach turned into a massacre. Still, they didn't retreat or surrender. They kept fighting, even when there was no hope. So Sukekuni, 67 years old, stayed in the fight until the very end. He led one last attack before he and his men were completely overwhelmed. Almost none of the defenders survived. The final stand on Tsushima was over. With no one left to stop them, the Mongols swept across the island. They killed civilians and burned villages to the ground. But the sacrifice of Sukekuni and his warriors wasn't pointless. During the fighting, a few boats escaped the island with one urgent message. The invasion had started. That warning reached the mainland in time. Japan now had a chance to prepare. The Mongol fleet moved next to Iki Island, where another small group of defenders fought bravely and were wiped out. Then the armada turned toward the Japanese mainland, landing at Hakata Bay. But here things were different. The mainland defenders had been alerted, they were ready, and they'd learned from Tsushima. Instead of charging into open battle, they used smarter tactics. They struck from small boats and launched hit-and-run raids. At night, they climbed onto Mongol ships and set them on fire. The invasion stalled. Mongol leaders, facing resistance and likely short on supplies, didn't press forward. Their fleet remained in the bay, ships packed together and exposed. Then the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in. The winds picked up. A huge storm slammed into the coast. Later, the Japanese would call it kamikaze, the divine wind. Whether the storm was as massive as the stories say is still debated, but what's certain is that the Mongol fleet, made up mostly of flat-bottomed riverboats not built for ocean travel, couldn't withstand it. Many ships were destroyed, smashed into each other, thrown onto rocks, or sunk. The first Mongol invasion had failed, broken by fierce resistance and the power of the storm. The survivors limped back to the continent. Their image of being unstoppable was gone. Back in Japan, the story of Tsushima changed. It wasn't remembered as a defeat, but as proof of the samurai's courage. So Sukekuni and his men became national heroes, symbols of loyalty, bravery, and honor. This is the answer to the question, how did a few hundred samurai stop thousands of invaders? They didn't win the fight, they didn't survive, but they shattered the idea that Japan could be easily taken. Their last stand gave Japan enough time to prepare. It helped lead to the invasion's eventual failure. Their sacrifice lit a fire that spread across the nation. The story of Tsushima, combined with the miracle of the kamikaze, helped form a powerful belief that Japan was protected by its gods and defended by warriors with unmatched spirit. But the threat wasn't over. Enraged by the defeat, Kublai Khan began planning a second invasion. In 1281, a much larger force set sail. Some say it had over 100,000 men. But Japan was ready this time, with stronger coastal defenses and smarter strategies. Once again, as the massive fleet waited offshore, another storm hit, stronger than the last. It crushed the Mongol armada and ended Kublai Khan's hopes of conquering Japan. The samurai of Tsushima didn't win that first battle, but their story became a symbol of something bigger. Their defeat turned into a lasting legend. It reminded the country what it meant to fight with honor, even when facing impossible odds. Though the Kamakura shogunate would eventually fall, the spirit of Tsushima lived on. The tale of Sukekuni and his warriors was told again and again, remembered as Japan's most heroic last stand. The battle at Tsushima wasn't just a fight, it became a legend. Though outnumbered and overwhelmed, Sō Sukekuni and his samurai showed Japan and the world what it meant to stand with courage, even in certain defeat. Their sacrifice sparked a national awakening, bought time to prepare, and helped turn the tide against the Mongol threat. Paired with the divine wind, their story shaped Japan's identity for generations. They didn't win with swords, but with spirit. Their final stand proved that even the greatest empires can be challenged, and that true strength lies in loyalty, unity, and never giving up.